Hey guys, Zane from the Infinite Jukebox here with another album review, and today I wanted to talk about the new Esther Rose record, Safe to Run. Being praised by some of her bigger fans as an essential name in Americana in the same way that musicians like Lucinda Williams and Gillian Welch were for the genre throughout the 90s and even 2000s, Esther Rose has been an important name for those obsessed with singer-songwriter types for a few years at this point, as she really does feel like a pretty solid representation of where the genre in general is at. Sure, she isn't some entirely game changing musician that is breaking down walls and genre fusion or anything like that, but nonetheless, her ability to create solid Americana with a number of strong country slash folk rock influences with a sort of twee pop adjacent sound attached to it has made her a name that's definitely worth paying attention to, whether you're a big singer songwriter person or not. Despite the fact that Safe to Run is certainly not her best work up to this point, it nonetheless remains a pretty solid record from Esther Rose, despite the fact that there are some definite creative missteps along the way. As an actual songwriter, Rose is capable of some very solid work, to say the least. Rather than being more of an archetypal storyteller type, such as some of her influences, Rose is a bit more personal in terms of her actual lyrical style, which kind of makes sense, meaning that her blunt delivery and depictions of things like heartbreak, love, and sentimentality suit her quite well as a whole. Many other singer-songwriters could definitely come across as a bit self-indulgent and maybe a bit one-note in this case, with most of Rose's songs being particularly about her own personal experiences rather than the experiences of other people, fictional or otherwise, but her songwriting style never really does grow old. It would be wrong to say that her songwriting style is raw and unfiltered like some of the greatest songwriters of today, but nonetheless, tracks like Dream Girl and Arm's Length have a sort of poetic kick to otherwise straightforward songs that just simply make sense, for lack of a better term. And with that in mind, it should be said that the Esther Rose catalog, if you will, is not something for people looking for a particularly enigmatic figure, a romanticist like Leonard Cohen, or maybe some sort of master craftswoman of lyrical content like Joni Mitchell. The reason that Esther Rose succeeds as a musician is not because she is some sort of great weaver of tales or anything like that in her songwriting. It's that she is entirely herself and doesn't base herself around any singer-songwriter tropes or stereotypes that many other different musicians and a number of her peers, in fact, often see as pitfalls in the way of their general success. She is successful because she is just her, and she doesn't let anything prevent that from happening. Despite the fact that she is a more than competent songwriter, Rose's vocal work is the biggest highlight of the majority of her releases, and Safe to Run is really no exception to this rule. Her vocal abilities are generally the strongest quality of the album from track to track. In fact, if you had to force me to pick one singular thing that I would specifically depict as being the highlight aspect of the entirety of Safe to Run as a listening experience, is getting to hear Esther Rose's voice again on a new release in a different context from her past releases. Tracks like Chet Baker are really heightened to a new level that they wouldn't otherwise be without the sweet vocal delivery of Rose, and generally speaking, she has a sort of constant zen flow, a peaceful cadence, if you will, that makes her somewhat mesmerizing in her best moments. In fact, there are times where her delivery and cadence style is somewhat similar to some classic country stars, which only makes sense in the context of an Americana album, but nonetheless it's something to take note of as it's a nice little addition to a record that's already just that, nice. Esther Rose may not be some sort of multifaceted or incredibly dynamic performer that's ready for superstardom or anything like that, but there's also no denying that she is more than capable of accurately and legitimately delivering her emotions in a fairly honest and sincere sounding way. In moments of joy, she sounds legitimately happy and at times even really at peace with her own emotions, and tracks that focus a bit more on the melancholy side of her music see her come across as believable, as someone going through an emotionally tumultuous or at least difficult time in life. Again, do I think that Esther Rose is the greatest vocalist of our time, of this generation of Americana musicians? Absolutely not. There are plenty of other musicians out there that feel more striking and powerful, even distinctive in nature, something that I will discuss in a moment. But nonetheless, as a whole, she has a very sweet, pleasant, and as I've stated, almost somewhat hypnotizing voice at times that really does take a number of tracks here to another level, with some instrumentals here even being so bare bones or somewhat unremarkable that without her voice they would merely just be mediocre and forgettable instrumentals. But between her songwriting abilities, which are competent, and her vocal work, which is genuinely very pleasant, she really does manage to take a number of songs here to just another plane. Look, I'm not saying that she's belting out notes with the power of 1,000 Patsy Clines or anything like that, but at the same time, the woman behind Safe to Run has an air of confidence about her that certainly translates over to her vocal performances as well. The biggest flaw of Safe to Run as a record, and the thing that truly holds it back more than anything else, is just the sad but true fact that it isn't very distinct as a whole. Pointing out that Esther Rose and her work on Safe to Run blends in heavily with the wider crowd of slightly above average Americana albums feels a touch obvious, if I'm being totally honest. Almost too obvious for me to even bother mentioning in this review, but nonetheless, it is also something that is very much so true. She's a very talented musician, no question, but all the talent in the world cannot prevent her from falling to the same classic stereotype that every slightly underground singer-songwriter sounds like every other slightly underground singer-songwriter. She is a talented musician with a pleasant voice, solid lyrical abilities, decent instrumentals backing her even. And it's not as if the record is too long or anything like that. 40-ish minutes is a fair runtime for this kind of listening experience. It's just the fact of the matter is that this album sounds like a lot of other Americana albums coming out right now. And of course, nothing really has to come across as the next big thing, but at the same time, you would hope that a record like this would have its own identity and maybe stand out from the crowd at least slightly. And although it's a pleasant album, it just doesn't do that. It certainly doesn't help that Safe to Run is a record that lacks really any distinctive hooks or choruses. Now, some singer-songwriters and folk country musicians can get away with being lyric-oriented with little classic structure, for lack of a better term, in their actual songs. Musicians like the previously mentioned Joni Mitchell, for example, that are capable of making amazing music without really relying on distinctive choruses that really stick in your head forever, instead relying on strong lyrical abilities, or sonic world building, or a variety of other things. A number of musicians are capable of really just running with those ideas and making amazing music with them without any real technical ability in regards to hooks and things like that. But Esther Rose is not one of those people, and that is something that is dearly needed here. Tracks like St. Francis Waltz are merely decent, pleasant songs that go in one ear and right out the other. They don't bring new ideas to the table, and they don't really present anything particularly memorable either, making for songs that are pretty, no doubt, but really, prettiness doesn't add up to much when you don't remember a song the second that it ends. The few songs that do have genuinely memorable moments, even if it's just a certain word or phrase being repeated, tracks like Full Value, for example, aren't really enough to elevate the album as a whole. I'm not saying that every song here needs to be the catchiest pop Americana song you've heard in your life, but at the same time, it really does feel like the lack of true identity that this record has, mixed with a lack of memorability, makes for something that, again, is decent, but also not nearly as good as it could have been. My point is that Safe to Run is not a mediocre album per se. It's a decent album, a perfectly fine and very enjoyable, admittedly, album. But with that in mind, this could have been so much more than merely just a collection of solid Americana songs that you probably won't even remember the name of in a week. This could have been genuinely a great collection of songs with a fantastic track list. The sonic atmosphere here is fairly gripping as a whole, and really the thing that this album needs is just something more. It could have used a stronger sense of identity and brought something new to the table in the realm of Americana or singer-songwriter types in general, something a bit more unique for Rose as a musician, or if it didn't want to go that route and instead just wanted to continue making more just straightforward Americana, it could have at least had some degree of memorability to it. Either which way, this album needs something more to it beyond what is actually presented here, which is fairly bare bones, even though, again, it's fine. Safe to Run is a solid record, without question. Never in a million years would I call this a bad record, and never in 100 years would I ever call this a mediocre record. And you know what? Genre fans will probably eat this up in minutes, in seconds even, and it's not really that hard to see why. After all, Esther Rose's lyrical abilities are strong enough to make you want to start a 40-ish minute long album, and the constant ability of her vocal work is enough to make you want to finish that same 40-ish minute long album. She's a talented musician that's capable of making you want to enter a room and stay in it. With that in mind, Safe to Run just isn't that distinct in the context of the grand scope of Americana music out there right now. With the world of streaming at our fingertips, there is so much singer-songwriter or singer-songwriter adjacent music that to really stand out, you need to do something particularly unique, and Esther Rose just doesn't do anything unique, and the fact that the album lacks any particular sense of distinctiveness in terms of structure certainly doesn't help her either. What I'm saying is that Safe to Run is a fine album, but ultimately it is an album that could have, and perhaps even should have, been better, even if it already is solid as it stands. I'm going to give this record 3 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that is the end of this album review. I've been Zane from the Infinite Jukebox. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.